As I shared in an earlier study, the first 11 chapters of Genesis are a kind of, introduction to the book, which begins in earnest in chapter 12 with the call of Abraham. Chapters 1 through 11 set the stage for Abraham's story by recounting creation, the fall, the chaos of human society void of God, the flood, and then the resurgence of humanity in chapter 10, which gives what's called the Table of Nations. In chapter 11, it seems that humanity learned nothing from the flood. Though the evidence of God's judgment loomed large over their immediate past, they appear to have renewed the efforts of their ancestors to live in a world without God. They may have been nudged on this path of rebellion by the career of a guy that we looked at in chapter 10, Nimrod. Let's dive right in, verse 1. Now the whole earth had one language and one speech. And it came to pass, as they journeyed from the east, that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. Chapter 10 tells us that Shinar is where Nimrod began his empire. It's the region that we know today as Mesopotamia, the scene of history's first great civilization, the Sumerians. It would seem that Nimrod was their leader. Archaeologists have worked the ruins of several ancient sites in this region. Verse 3, Then they said to one another, Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They had brick for stone, and they used asphalt for mortar. And they said, Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower whose top is in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we become scattered abroad over the face of the whole earth. And right there, we get a hint that Nimrod is behind this. God had told Noah and his sons to go forth and fill the earth. Here they purpose to resist that command. They aren't going to go forth and fill. They're going to band together and settle down. And they aren't out to honor God's name. Their goal is to make a name for themselves. What unites them is the construction of a tower to tower above everything else. Its top would literally be to the heavens. That is, it's dedicated to them. Now, some commentators believe this means that the top of the tower was intended to be a place to observe the stars, and that astrology was born there. It is true that astrology and the occult find their origin in the primal religion of Babylon. But note what the tower was made of: baked brick and asphalt. Check it out. They made their tower waterproof. They knew that what they were doing was contrary to God's will, but they pressed on anyway. Worried that God might do again what he'd done before and flood the earth, well, they made a waterproof tower, a kind of stationary ark. Though God promised to not judge the earth by a flood again, being deceitful themselves, they imagined that God must be as well. Archaeologists have found kiln-fired brick and asphalt building materials around the site of ancient Babylon. So let's recap. After the flood, God told Noah's family to start over. Noah's 3 sons and their wives began the repopulation of earth. A short few generations later, a leader named Nimrod emerges. He builds an empire and then offers a vision in contrast to following God. Instead of spreading out as God had told them, Nimrod unites them in a project of independence from God rather than dependence on him. Knowing what they're doing is contrary to God's will, they try to protect themselves from his judgment. Well, let's see how that's all going to work out for them, shall we? Verse 5, But the Lord came down to the city and to the tower, which the sons of men had built. Now, God is omnipresent and omniscient, so of course he knew all about their project. More importantly, he knew why they were engaging in it. God's action of checking in on them is described in a purposefully casual way. See, Moses is about to tell us what God did about their little project. He begins it all in a light and almost kind of joking tone. He's playing off the seriousness of their attempts to get around God's judgment. Picture a couple of kids at the beach making a sandcastle. They've started it at low tide, well back from the wave line. They pile up the sand a couple of feet high, and they carve it into little blocks that make it look like stone walls of an actual castle. It has battlements and a moat. It's several feet square. It's impressive. People on the beach take pictures of it with their smartphones. And then the tide comes in. Now, is that sandcastle going to withstand the waves? No, it's not. Not even for a minute. It's going to crumble with the first wave and be obliterated by the second. And so it is with their project on the Shinar Plain, with their attempt to resist God. Man's attempts to divert the course of history from God's plan are doomed. What God has planned is what will be. The only choice that we face is to comply with that plan and know his amazing blessing in a flourishing life, or resist it and end up broken and confused. Friends, fret not at the schemes of the godless who reject God and work feverishly to remove all evidence of God's word and will from the public square. Worry not at all about laws that install immorality, nor courts that reward evil while punishing the righteous. It's all just a tower by a secular society that wants to go its own way and make itself a name. It has smugly assumed that it can avoid judgment by building with brick and mortar of secularism. It can't, and it won't, just as this ancient society couldn't and didn't. Verse 6, and the Lord said, indeed, the people are one, and they have one language. And this is what they will begin to do. Now nothing that they propose to do will be withheld from them. Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Now, God says something here worth taking careful note of. Humanity has incredible potential. Whether the potential is harnessed to good or evil depends on where our heart is. If God is at the center of our thoughts, amazing works of justice and charity prevail. But if self reigns, well, we have the capacity for grotesque evil, as history amply proves. Under Nimrod's lead, it was a reprise of the world before the flood. People were once again headed down a destructive path. So in his mercy and grace, God intervened by confusing their speech. Now, before we go on, did you catch the pun in verse 7? This is where we see Moses' humor. In verse 3, the people said, come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly. In verse 4, they say, come, let us build ourselves a city. This was the slogan that they had attached to their project. It became a kind of rallying cry to unite them. If you've ever worked for a big company or a major concern, you know how they embark on new projects, initiatives, and campaigns that last from as little as a year to maybe a decade. And to get everybody on board, they come up with slogans that they print on posters. They put them on t-shirts and pens and notepads and coffee mugs. Managers sprinkle them throughout their daily briefings. They're used in marketing to identify people with a product. You know, Nike, just do it. Lay's potato chips, bet you can't eat just one. McDonald's, I'm loving it. State Farm Insurance, like a good neighbor. United Airlines, fly the friendly skies. Subway, eat fresh. Those building the tower had a slogan that united them in their project. Come, let us unite and build. Well, in verse 7, God mocks them. He says, come, let's divide and scatter. Verse 8, and so the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of all the earth, and they ceased building the city. Therefore, its name is called Babel, which means confusion, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth, and from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. The confusion of languages that happened at Babel was less a judgment as it was a manifestation of God's grace. They were bent on rebellion, and left to themselves, they would have recreated the horrible conditions that existed prior to the flood. God preempted their plans by confusing their speech so they couldn't understand one another. Both history and God's word suggest that all the people of a family shared a common tongue. But the major clans could not understand each other, and so they sorted out and moved off in different directions to form new societies. As they did, they realized the world was vast. So why all stay in one place as Nimrod had commanded when the world was huge and there were so many great places to live? And so people moved away from Shinar and settled new regions. After a couple of generations, there were always those unique individuals who wanted to see what was, well, a little further along. You know, what's over that hill, past that valley, on the other side of that river? And so the edge of human civilization kept spreading until the entire planet was covered. Now, chapters 10 and 11 show us how quickly things got messed up after the flood. We might think that people would have been more cautious, more careful about maintaining a close connection to God, but they didn't. They didn't because they hadn't personally witnessed the flood. They had just heard the tale. And with each new generation, the account of the flood was more removed from them. As it became less real, it turned from a lesson into just a story, and from a story into a legend, and from a legend into a myth. People came to say, so what? Who cares that our ancestors used to believe all that stuff? This is our time, and it's time for us to get on with things on our own. All that God stuff was fine for our backward ancestors, but, well, we've had to depend on ourselves now. And look what we're able to accomplish when we work together under a great leader like Nimrod. And they thought that they were building themselves a tower, not realizing they were in fact digging their grave. And so God graciously intervened and broke it up. As they spread out across the earth, God stepped into the life of one man and began to reveal himself to him in a unique and special way. That man was Abraham. The story of Genesis now turns to him. We find the line leading to him in the last verses of chapter 11. Verse 10. This is the genealogy of Shem. Shem was 100 years old and begot Arphaxad 2 years after the flood. After he begot Arphaxad, Shem lived 500 years and begot sons and daughters. Arphaxad lived 35 years and begot Salah. After he begot Salah, Arphaxad lived 403 years. Salah lived 30 years and begot Eber. After he begot Eber, Salah lived 403 years and begot sons and daughters. Eber lived 34 years and begot Peleg. After he begot Peleg, Eber lived 430 years and begot sons and daughters. Peleg lived 30 years and begot Reu. After he begot Reu, Peleg lived 209 years and begot sons and daughters. Reu lived 32 years and begot Serug. After he begot Serug, Reu lived 207 years and begot sons and daughters. Serug lived 30 years and begot Nahor. After he begot Nahor, Serug lived 200 years and he begot sons and daughters. Nahor lived 29 years and begot Terah. After he begot Terah, Nahor lived 119 years and begot sons and daughters. Now Terah lived 70 years and begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. So 9 generations after Noah, through his son Shem, we come to Terah. And then verse 27, this is the genealogy of Terah. Terah begot Abraham, Nahor, and Haran. Haran begot Lot. Abram is going to get a new name, later known as Abraham. For now, just note that Lot was Abram's nephew. Verse 28, and Haran died before his father Terah in his native land in Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was one of the chief cities of what will later be called the Kingdom of Babylon. Verse 29, then Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, and the name of Nahor's wife Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah, and the father of Iscah. Just as Abram's name is later changed, his wife Sarai will have a name change to Sarah. Abram's brother Nahor married his niece Milcah. Verse 30, but Sarai was barren. She had no child. That's going to become a major part of Abraham's story later. Verse 31, and Terah took his son Abram and his grandson Lot, the son of Haran, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abraham's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. And they came to Haran and dwelt there. So the days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran. Now, later in Abraham's story, we're going to see that it was, in fact, he who initiated this move. It wasn't his father. They traveled northwest from Ur and settled in a place that they named after the brother who had passed away. It's provocative to pause and realize that history has circled round and come back to a situation very much like what we find in those early verses of chapter 11. The planet that they spread into after the confusion of languages, well, it's been filled now. Because of modern transportation, people can move freely about the entire globe. The families of the earth are mixing as never before. The political and religious strife of Africa, Asia, and the Middle East has seen a massive flow of refugees moving into the Western world. Ethnic groups that used to stay to themselves in Western cities, well, they're now integrated into the larger culture. Inter-ethnic marriage is at an all-time high. The language barrier is falling due to modern media and technology. Of the 195 nations in the world today, all but 2 of them are members of the United Nations. Nations align in trade and political alliances like NATO and NAFTA and the EU. All of this is taking place in the context of a society which considers itself modern and equates that with a scientific mindset that's moved beyond the supposed superstition of religion. The modern world, dominated as it now is by a secular worldview, doesn't need God. Science explains everything. Technology will save us. The God who came down to the Tower of Babel is about to come down again, this time to end it. In the meantime, we're to be about what we ought to have been about, loving and serving God. We're not out to make a name for ourselves. Our goal is to make His name great. We're not building a city because ours has already been built. The grace of God that halted the work on Babel and scattered the people is still at work today. The grace that set Abraham's family apart calls us into that family today. Abraham's family isn't composed just of his physical descendants. It includes all who trust in Jesus. What people need today isn't more technology, it isn't more science or stuff. People need Jesus. He is the answer to the problems of our world today.